Buddy, I'll get started in just a minute. I'm just going to make sure everything is working on my live streams. All right. Looks like we are good to go. All right. All right. Well, welcome to another episode of The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast. I'm your host, Professor Ace, and this particular podcast is a little bit different. Um, I had a guest that I had met at the NASW conference in Chicago, and she had to cancel last minute. So here I am. This is supposed to be the last episode of this fall season. And rather than cancel it, I thought we'd do something a little bit different, which is a little bit, I'm not going to lie, it's a little bit daunting for me, just in the sense of I've never done this before, just, going live on my own. But we're going to do the best that we can. So if you could just give me a minute longer, I am trying to find, I just got a list of my talking points that I wanted to make sure I cover. And here we go. Make sure I have everything open. It's a little glitchy. All right. Well, sometimes I can't help that. The internet, I'm out here in rural Hawaii, and sometimes it's going to be a little glitchy. So hopefully it'll work out all right. But the if not, then the final recording, it records locally, so I'll be able to get you a better copy a little bit later on. Um, so I'm going to take it again from the top, if you don't mind, if everybody doesn't mind, just so. Um, yeah, here we go. Okay. So, all right, all right. Welcome to another episode of The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast. I am your host, Professor Ace, and this episode's a little bit different. Like I was saying, I had another guest scheduled, somebody I had met at the NASW conference in Chicago, but she had to cancel last minute. So rather than cancel the entire episode, since being it's the last one of the season, I thought we'd try something a little bit different and just have an open conversation, an open dialogue. I have some things I want to talk about, but as always, and especially in this episode, if you have something to say, if you have a question, something to contribute to the dialogue, to the conversation, then please use the chat. Or if you're brave enough, and I think you have to be on a computer for it, but you can use the call in feature and we can talk face to face, bring you here on video, or I think you can do it on audio as well. Um, but yeah, I'm going to talk about whatever questions you all have, things like that. But I'm also going to talk about revolutionary social work. I'm going to talk about my resignation from the university. I won't go into too much detail, but just talk about what it means for me, maybe a little bit of why I've decided to move on, and what the future might hold. Um, if something I say hits you in any kind of way, um, makes you think a little bit deeper, or you want me to go in a little bit deeper, then just let me know, and I'll try to get to the chat as best that I can. Um, and I'd rather respond to you all and answer questions than just talk at you for an hour or so. So if you already have a question, make sure you put it in there. And I thought I'd start this off with one or two personal stories, and it'll get to know me a little bit better. And one of those things is, a lot of people call me Professor Ace, and a lot of people in my personal life call me Ace. And it's interesting because I heard some criticism recently that essentially that somebody thought that me going by Professor Ace in a professional sphere was unprofessional in a sense, and that I was trying to be cool or something like that. And I thought I'd just give you a little history on where that name Professor Ace came from, how that came to be. So I was born Christian Ace Stetler, and my father is also named Christian Ace Stetler, and there was no designation for junior or anything like that. And my dad goes by Chris, and so growing up, my whole life they called me Ace. And as a matter of fact, I had no idea that my name was Christian. And I remember in third grade that, back in the day, I'm not sure if you have to do it anymore this way, but back in the days when they give you the standardized testing, you had to fill out a little bubble sheet and, put your name in carefully and fill out the bubble sheet. Well, I was embarrassed because I couldn't write Christian. I didn't know how to spell it. And so the teacher had to come over. It was embarrassing and all that. So, long story short, there is I didn't even know my name was Christian until like third grade, maybe somewhere around there. And the kids at the school that I went to back then, they used to relentlessly tease me about the name Ace. There used to be the Ace hardware commercials. Um, Ace is the place for hardware. If you remember those, I'm not sure if they're still around, but they used to relentlessly tease me, and so I grew to really dislike the name and was embarrassed by it. And so, by the time I was a teenager, maybe a young adult, I had completely disowned the name Ace and only introduced myself as Chris or Christian. And, some of my family, actually, a lot of my family still called me Ace. It's hard for somebody to get rid of something that they've called you forever. And Ace was kind of a term of endearment for them, if that makes sense. And so I went by Chris and Christian, except for my family called me Ace still a little bit. And then I had my best friend from back in the day. His name's Howard Tapusoa, and he was around. He would come around my family a lot, and noticed that they call me Ace, and so he picked it up. And then like kind of like a domino effect, he started calling me Ace, and then all the other people at at my job back in the day at Cottonwood Treatment Center and elsewhere, they started calling me Ace. And there was still kind of fringe. And I remember I was living up in Barrow, Alaska, in Utqiagvik. I don't know, like 13, 14 years ago, and I was at a friend I just met, her house, a group of us friends, and her mom came over, and she was kind of frowning upon our cast of characters, you might say. And I can't remember exactly how it went down, but I think I introduced myself as Christian, and my friend introduced me as Ace. And she really mocked me for it. Says, "What is it, Ace? Oh, that's cool." And I'm like, "It's literally my name. You know what I mean? It's on my driver's license. That's who I am." And anyways, that's one example. And then you moving down the road further in the professional sphere, I'd almost exclusively went by Christian. And when I started off as a professor, most people called me Christian or Professor Stetler. And maybe, I don't know, 2 years ago or so, I make introductory videos in each one of my classes that are online asynchronous. And in one of them, I had said that I don't mind whatever you want to call me is fine. If you want to call me Christian, if you want to call me Professor Stetler, just call me Professor, whatever you want. You can even call me Ace if you want. That's my middle name. And I was very surprised actually at how many students picked that up and called me Professor Ace. And so I essentially reclaimed it and readopted it. And it's just really interesting that I get criticized or people look down upon that. And I think it's one of the things of just being different. And so I just want you to know that my name literally is Ace. And for a large part of my life, that's all that I knew myself as. And that's how most of my family, that's all they know me as. They wouldn't maybe not even know who you're talking about if you said Christian. And I went through all the bullying and teasing and all of that back in the day. And so I feel like I've earned the right to go by Ace. And so I just wanted to give a little insight into why I'm called Professor Ace or why people call me Ace. And Another story I just wanted to open up and share is around the power of connection and the way that the universe works things out sometime. And I don't want to go into too many details here, but I have a sister. I don't know, you want to call it a half sister, um, 10 years younger than me, and we had become ostracized from each other. There's some, interfamily beef, and none of that I want to get into, but we hadn't talked for quite a while, and there'd been some small attempts at reconciliation and things like that, but it just hadn't worked out. And I was really close to this sister when I was younger. She was, like I said, she was 10 years younger than me, but I used to take her to do all kinds of things when she was a little girl. And I got into drugs and drifted away, and we kind of were still somewhat close, although we were separated by distance. She had moved away and all of that. But over the last, I don't even know how long, 10 years or so, we have been disconnected almost completely. And I have a student, a practicum student right now that I've been advising and helping, and she was going through some struggles. And typically, when, at least for me, when I go through situations like that with somebody, and I'm helping them out, and we're talking a lot and working through things, you build a relationship. And through that, she came across my sister and recognized that we had the same last name. She asked her if she knew me and talked about me. And long story short, I got a message from my sister not too long ago. It said that she had met my student and she had nice things to say about me, and she wanted to reconnect. And lo and behold, just a few weeks later, she came out here to Hawaii and came over yesterday evening and spent time with my family. I got to know my children, her nieces and nephew. My children got to know their aunt, and it was just such a beautiful thing. Um, and I think there's lessons to be learned there in the sense of, you know, family cutting each other off and disconnecting, and some of the drama and the things that we go through sometimes. And, just how meaningful the reconnection is, and, not to give up hope when we've lost connection with someone. Sometimes we get cut off, or we've cut off people because it could be because of politics, or, like I said, interfamily drama and things like that. But the universe works in mysterious ways, and to me, it's a really bizarre circumstance. What are the odds of that? That I'm in Hawaii, I have a student in Alaska. That I didn't even know my sister lived in Alaska at this time, and for that connection to be made is just really cool. And I just wanted to share that as a very meaningful moment for me. And yeah, there's a comment in the chat from Monica. It says, "Good morning. Can you share how you entered the educational side of social work? Were there any additional certificates or programs that you had to go through to be a professor?" Yeah, that's a good question. I'd actually graduated with my MSW in 2016, I think, from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and moved away for a little bit. Went to Utah for, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years, and then came back to Honolulu. And my wife had gone to Hawaii Pacific University, which is the private university. There's two universities in Hawaii that offer social work: the State University, University of Hawaii, and then Hawaii Pacific University, the private university. And my wife had went there, and I can't remember how it went down, but they had reached out to her to ask her if she would want to be an adjunct and teach the practicum course, and she couldn't do it. She was too busy. And me, I was, had aspirations for a PhD, and needed some part-time work. And so she recommended me. I went over there and met with the leader of the department, and they hired me as an adjunct professor. And no, I didn't have to do any other certifications or anything like that. I think one thing you might have to think about is to teach certain MSW practice courses. I think you have to have an MSW and maybe 2 years of post MSW graduate experience in the field. But other than that, no, you don't need anything. I think most universities are going to require a PhD. Some universities might hire adjuncts or even a full-time instructor or professor without a PhD, because, in, say, Alaska and Hawaii, the pickings might be a little bit slim, separated from the continental United States and things like that. But if you were in, back east or in the continental United States somewhere, it might be a little more difficult and you might need the PhD. As for me, I've been working on a PhD the entire time I've been a professor. So I started as an adjunct, did that, taught practicum classes, taught practice class. They actually picked me up. I taught Sociology 101, and then the University of Hawaii reached out to me at one point, and through a friend that recommended me, and I taught some more sociology classes, juvenile delinquency, intro to social or introduction to sociology at that university, and I taught. And then I was before I moved over here to the Indigenous Studies department at UAF. I was a PhD student in the Department of Educational Foundations at University of Hawaii, and while I was there, I also taught several courses. I taught I can't even remember what they were called. A sociology and education class. I taught introduction to multicultural education, things like that. And then during the pandemic, we moved back to Alaska, and I semi got recruited from the university to put in an application, and they hired me. And so I've been doing that. This is my fourth year at UAF. And Alicia asked, how has your teaching evolved since the first class that you taught? What has contributed to that evolution? Yeah, that's another good question. So I think there's 2 points here. One would be that practicum course that I taught. I didn't get really any instruction on how to do it. They passed on a syllabus, but they didn't tell me I had to do anything. And so I just kind of did my own thing. And I I didn't integrate talking circles in that first semester, but kind of in the spirit of it, I spent a lot of time listening to the students. We spent a lot of time talking and dialoguing about the experience that they were having at practicum, and it was just really, really positive. And so, another turning point would be when I taught that introduction to sociology class, or sorry, not the introduction to sociology class, but it was a sociology class at University of Hawaii called juvenile delinquency. And although I'd worked with juvenile delinquency for many years, I had no experience in teaching it. And same thing, they didn't give me any instruction. There was a textbook that they passed on to me and a syllabus. And I was in there teaching that class. And this was much different student population than I have now. It was almost all like 19, 20, 21-year olds, almost exclusively, if not everybody. I don't think there was any older students or non-traditional students in there. Student athletes, things like that. And I'm in there, and I had designed the course just like many professors do based on the textbook. There were 13 chapters in the textbook, and I outlined the syllabus and was going to cover things week to week. And I was in there, and I'm standing up there, and I'm just not a very good, I shouldn't say I'm not very good, but lecturing is not my thing. I prefer dialogue. I believe in dialogue. And I was up there, and I was like, what the hell am I doing here? These students are looking at me like I'm crazy. They're not participating in any way. And so I had consulted with my old mentor, grandmother Rita, briefly, and she advised me to integrate the talking circles. And I was nervous about it at first. So I sat, and this is a pretty big class. So it was like, I don't know, 20, 20 to 25 students around in a circle in this little classroom. And at first they looked at me like I was crazy, and a lot of them didn't have anything to say. But by like the third or fourth class, everybody was talking, and it was like this very robust atmosphere of all these young students, and they were, um, they became a part of it. Instead of me just delivering some bullshit to them, if that makes sense, that I got from a textbook that I didn't have time to read myself, they participated in it, and I got so much positive feedback afterwards in the class and in the evaluations. But not only that, students emailed me out of unsolicited and said like, "Hey, I just want to say thank you for the way that you facilitated the class. When I came to the class, I didn't think I had anything to say. I didn't think I had anything to contribute, but you gave me the space and let me know that I did. And now I feel confident in talking. It it gave some of them, the confidence to speak in front of other people. But I think most of all, it let them know that they weren't just some tool there for me to deliver a bunch of information to, that they came with information, they came with wisdom, they came with life experience, even though they were young students. And I was just so motivated by that. I tried various ways to integrate talking circles. And in the second year that I taught the practicum class at going back to Hawaii Pacific University, I think I taught it for 3 years. Um, the students were they were so happy about the way I facilitated the class and the talking circles that they made me a plaque. I've got it. It's upstairs in my regular office. I'm down here in the dungeon where my wife usually works. right now, but they made me a plaque and they took me out to dinner to thank me for how meaningful of an experience it was and how different it was from some of their other experiences in higher education. And so ever since then, I've been trying to find my way, and it led me to post-pandemic when everything got moved online and me teaching mostly online asynchronous classes and finding ways to integrate the talking circles. And so now I do some of them voluntary through I just host, I call it jam session, and have talking circles once a week, and they're voluntary, and a good group of amount of students come every week, and it's very, very meaningful. It's one of the things that I'm most proud of and the things that fill up my heart more than anything else. And so, I think there's more than I can say on how my teaching has evolved, but the talking circles, but also a deep sense of listening. I spend a lot of time and energy listening to what the students say and what their experience is and what they say that they need. And I try very hard to integrate that in and provide a meaningful experience. I realize that a lot of times education, social work, and elsewhere, it can be this environment where you're passed on information, the banking model of education, just a delivery system. But I found that it's so much more meaningful when you feel like you're a part of it and it's meaningful for you and you feel like you have something to say and you're able to learn from not just from me, but I'm able to learn from the students, and we're all able to learn from each other. And that's where I'm at now, and you know that's a big part of how I facilitate my classes and what I try to do. Alice said I had Social Work 103 with an ebook and all e-lessons as I simultaneously took your 101 with all the interaction. And I too feel like the interactive learning was much more valuable to my learning. Yeah, thank you, Alice. And Monica said, after you leave your position at UAF, do you have a plan to continue using talking circles in other employment, volunteer work, or within your community? And it's another good question, Monica. Thanks. Absolutely. Talking circles is if you don't already know, is the subject of my dissertation, which I'm hopefully graduating with a PhD this spring. Um, and obviously, if that's the gist of my PhD, then it's something that I better be using, right? And it's something that I strongly believe in. So I don't know how exactly I will utilize talking circles moving forward. I might have another job at a different university at some point, and I wouldn't take a job if they wouldn't allow me to utilize the talking circles. I realize that oftentimes they're not valued in higher education. People look at them as non-efficient. Um, some people just don't understand them. And I think you could come to one circle and not get it at all because while one talking circle can be meaningful and helpful, it takes oftentimes it takes time. It takes participating in several over time to really get something out of it, especially if you haven't ever been a part of something like that. So you just showing up to one can kind of plant the seed and you might get an idea of it. But the real transformation comes when you participate over a long period of time, if that makes sense. And I think I don't think the many of my students that come to the talking circles now have requested that I continue the talking circles beyond this. So through the winter break and beyond, I'm going to leave those open as much as I can and have and keep facilitating the talking circles because for multiple reasons, because students need connection even when it's not within a semester. And I need the connection too, and I learn from everybody and the relationships that we build. So I'm going to try to keep those going. I've had people that are affiliated or ask me questions about revolutionary social work have asked me to facilitate them, and I just haven't had the bandwidth or the space to do it, if you know what I mean. Um, I I've just been so busy with the PhD and being a professor and being a father. I'm just like sometimes I don't know what to do with myself. I just don't have the time, and so perhaps I can do that sometime in the future. Another way that I utilize talking circles right now is I was invited. Some of you may have been to some of these before through my classes as opportunities, as options. But there's a this organization called Kaya Ulu, based on the island of Kauai here in the Hawaiian Islands, and they they facilitate synchronized indigenous ceremonies across the globe. It's just via Zoom, but it has indigenous elders from Colombia, from Hawaii, from Alaska, from the States, from the Virgin Islands, from Africa. and it's really a cool thing. So if you want to know any more about that, let me know, and I'll send you a link. The new moon ceremonies happen. It was just a full moon, I believe, last night. So a couple weeks here, and they'll have another one. And they started a group called the what is it called? It's called the geez, I can't even think of what it's called, but they started a group, um, and it's full of professors, mostly scientists and indigenous elders. And they asked me to facilitate talking circles. So I've been meeting regularly with them and facilitating the talking circles. And that's been an honor that they would even ask me to do something like that. And it's just been a great experience for me. And we're supposed to have an in-person gathering um, in the spring, in March or April, uh, where they've invited all of us to bring our families and integrate into talking circles and things like that. And so, yeah, that's all I have right there. Let me go through this chat, and then I'm going to bring on Tina into. Um, she's calling in. Uh, Jade, hey, I miss you, Jade. It's been a long time since I heard from you. I need to put you in the. I'll send you a calendar link to the talking circles if you ever want to join us. That are still going on. I don't know why I haven't already invited you to them, but Jade says, I miss jam sessions. However, they carry into daily life as a reminder to be with people in the present moment, allowing others to speak their truths and to process my own. Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that, Jade. One of the beautiful things about talking circles compared to, like, say, a focus group or just a regular group is that oftentimes they get into debates. What we want to do in this day and age is argue with each other sometimes, or our first thing we want to say is, I agree with this or disagree with this. And one of the elders that I've learned from, Unangan elder Ilarion Merculius, would say that you're not supposed to use violent language in a talking circle. And that obviously includes, like, racial epithets and hate language and stuff like that. But on a much deeper level, he would say that saying I disagree is violent language. And that we shouldn't do that. And so in a talking circle, if you're on the other side of the circle, you might hear what somebody's saying, and you might think to yourself, I disagree with that. But by the time it gets over to you, you've spent so much time listening that you don't have it, the disagreement leaves your heart, and you realize and understand that that person on the other side of the circle might say something different than what you think or what your experience is, but it makes space for different truths. And over time, it's not like this thing where I think sometimes in our world we think that, hey, I'm going to tell people that they're wrong and what I believe in, they're going to change their mind. But that almost never happens. People have their own life experience and their own views, and it takes time. And so what it does is it brings us a little bit close together by listening, deep sense of listening. You share your truth, I share mine. We may not agree 100% right away, but we probably move a little bit closer to each other, by allowing them to speak their truths and not responding immediately. You got to wait until it comes around to you. So I appreciate that, Jade. And Jesse says there's a lot of value in being able to engage in a way that you connect it back to your own life. I wish more classes were based on that instead of heavy reading and rote and memory testing. Yeah, and I um, I fully concur with that, Jesse. Try not to use the word agree, but I align with that 110%. I think that especially with the emergence of artificial intelligence and having all pretty much, not, I wouldn't want to say all wisdom, but any kind of information in the world right at your disposal, the old way of memorizing things and then taking an exam doesn't make sense anymore. And it didn't make sense before, but it really doesn't make sense now. And so what does it matter if I learn to memorize something, but I don't connect my own life to it, or I don't see myself in it? There's a chapter even in a book called "We Make the Road by Walking" by Paulo Freire and Miles Horton. That I can't remember the exact name of the chapter, but it's something like um, it's about biology. Can you would you Why do you need to connect biology or say like calculus to your personal life? And many of us that probably were in school and we asked that question. Um, what does this have to do with me? Why do I have to learn this? I'm never going to use this. And the teacher is not able to answer the question. Well, from my perspective, if you can't answer that question, what does it have to do with you? When am I going to use it? And you don't have a real meaningful way to respond to that, then the students are not going to want to learn it. And so even in something like biology, we ought to be able to place ourselves in the world and connect ourselves to it. And how does it connect to us in our lives? Um, that's all I got on that for now. Keep the questions coming. I love it. I got a lot of more talking points too that I'm sure folks love questions. I'm going to bring Tina on right now. Tina, so good to see you. How are you? Oh, I can't hear you. Still can't hear you. If you click on that mic thing on the bottom, it might be somewhere else. Still, still can't hear you. Um, all right, we'll see if Tina can check back in. Charlie says, echoing Jesse, I wish the connection element was in more social work courses specifically. If history of social work courses would encourage students to share their experience with the history and present of social work could help bring more understanding to folks across the spectrum of life experiences. And that's true, especially in something like history of social work. It's often taught with the banking model of education. These were Jane Addams and so were the ones that started social work, modern social work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that if I were teaching history of social work, I would do exactly what Charlie said, and I would open it up to everybody's experiences and their thoughts. And I would actually encourage folks to bring in, their own idea of social work in history. Some people might say, well, Bob Marley was a social worker. Some people, um, might say like abolitionists back in the day, they were social workers. Some people might say the folks that ran an orphanage, that they were social workers, things like that. People like that. Some people might say indigenous elders or healers, medicine men, medicine women, things like that, people like that, that they might be social workers or that they are social workers. And so I think that would definitely broaden it up. Um, let's see. I want to get to some, as always, if you have questions, bring them in. But I have some things I wanted to talk about as well. I wanted to talk about revolutionary social work. Lots of you that I see in the chat and that are in here should know quite a bit about revolutionary social work, but it's really just something that's evolving and is not such a concrete thing, but something um, that we build upon. And I'm going to return to that because we got Tina coming back in. Let's see if we can get her. Hey, Tina. No, still can't hear you. I don't know what's going on. I've had some issues with Riverside lately, so maybe Tina can pop her question into the chat. I'm sorry that didn't work out. So back to revolutionary social work. Like I said, it's something that's building, and it's not really like a new model of social work or some kind of checklist. It's more of a way of being or a way of looking at things and a way of being in a relationship with social work. And for me, the reason I don't want to say I created social work, but I created maybe this version or this foundation of it because I felt that social work and whatnot, it lacked meaning in some ways, and it has become more of just a profession. Not saying it being a profession is bad. Obviously, the profession of social work is very important, but I felt like there could be something deeper, and there should be something deeper. And I felt that through my own experiences. I felt that um, through hearing what my students had to say, and I just felt like social work needed a value system. It needed something different, and revolutionary social work, the word revolution, a lot of different people use it. People might think of like the Revolutionary War. They might think of the, Black Power, revolutionary movements of those times. But what I mean by revolution, when I say revolutionary social work, is something that's just always revolving. There was an old guy that he's long past now from the Move organization. His name was John Africa, and he would say that, if your heart doesn't keep uh, revoluting, you'll die. If your lungs don't keep revoluting, you'll die. And so I think what happens sometimes when we have something like social work is we get stagnant in it, if that makes sense, and we stop the revolution. And so how I view revolutionary social work is a constant changing process, just like with ourselves, our self-examination. We shouldn't be the same person next week, next year, in 5 years that we were today, because we learn more. We should be reflecting and we should be getting to know ourselves and the world better. And so it's a constant revolution, and that's what I look at. And so for me, revolutionary social work starts with self-examination. it asks us to continuously look at ourselves. Am I actually living the values that I claim? Or maybe we don't even know what our values are. And so we have to think about it and reflect and maybe write them down. Um, how do we show up in relationships? How do I show up in relationships? Not just with my clients, but with myself, with my family, with students, with the land that I live on, that I'm a part of, with the community, the various communities I'm a part of. And I think there's also political clarity. I think that oftentimes in social work, we mistakenly align with political parties or with it's pretty much one political party, the Democrats right now. And I don't want to get into that, um, this Democrat Republican thing, anything like that. I don't want to talk about that. But my point is that when we align with a big political party like that and we're not critical about it and we don't deviate in any way, we just become an arm of that. And so I think revolutionary social work also says that we should be nonpartisan. And I'll talk about that in a minute. We don't have party loyalty, but we have loyalty to ourselves, to our families, to the people we work with, if that makes sense. We think about and we're honest about where the power is, and who gets harmed from it and all of that. I think revolutionary social work decenters compliance and instead it recenters things like humanity, kinship, consciousness, and it asks us to keep transforming ourselves while we work towards transforming others. I say this often, but um, we have to be able to change ourselves before we can ever help somebody else. We've got to be thriving ourselves before we can ever help somebody else thrive. And not to get religious here, but there is a biblical passage, a scripture that talks about the plank in the eye, and I think without botching it, I think what happens in that is in that in that scripture is that um, that it's saying that you have to take the plank out of your own eye before you can help somebody else remove the plank from their eye, if that makes sense. And I didn't explain that very well, but I got a lot on my mind, so you'll have to forgive me. And one thing to think about too is other terms you might hear, even on the name of this podcast, is called the critical social worker. It has revolutionary in there, but it's the critical social worker. And there's also radical social work, which you might hear to a lesser degree. But critical and radical social work often start by analyzing the system. So they're critical and reflective, but about the systems that govern us, that control the power, things like that. But revolutionary social work would take a little bit of a different approach. Not saying we wouldn't question the systems, obviously we do, but it would say like, who am I becoming when I do that? How do I treat people? How do I treat myself? Am I reproducing the same ideas, the same harms in my everyday life? Those kind of things. So it focuses a little bit, not a little bit, it focuses more on the self. Um, while it does look at systems, the primary part there is focusing on the self. Um, I just want to go back to Tina, who here in the chat. Let me see if I got everyone. Yeah, Tina says, I just wanted to share that the talking circles are happening at the elementary level, and I'm so happy to see the students engage in deeper connections with peers and education. Education in Alaska has a history of trauma, so it is a beautiful thing to see the talking circles continue and expand. I've been in the education field for 10 years, and your class gave me the reassurance that it is okay to host circles, as my school team did not approve that I was sticking to the curriculum. All right, I'm going to bring Tina's on. I think she figured out her mic. Here, give it one more shot. Hey, Tina, you there?
Still not working?
I can hear you. I can't see you, but I can
Oh,
hear you.
great, great, great. Okay, I will continue to try to turn that the camera on. So I just wanted to share that I just really appreciate you and the ability to see what talking circles can be like in the ways that you have made them part of your class, and being able to host them here at the elementary level and with younger students. Um, we have worked a lot on restorative practice, and restorative circles is kind of, it's the same but different. And to be able to really host in every single class, we have over 300 students here at school. And so every student that I get to see in my space has had an opportunity for restorative circles. And typically something has happened, harm has happened in the classroom. Whether one student has tipped over a desk or threw a chair, or whatever behavior might have caused the breakdown in the classroom. And so we've learned how to host these quick restorative practice circles to heal the harm that's been done so that we can move on and build the relationships and make them stronger. And one of the things that I've done in this classroom is allow these classes to have these big talking circles where oftentimes I can come up with an idea if they don't have one. But most times, a group of 30 kids can come in and they have an idea already of what they want to talk about. And the dialogue is really powerful and meaningful for them. And yesterday, one of the classes, the topic was around yelling and being yelled at, and just how they process that in their body and how that feels for them in the moment. And it was a beautiful thing for 5 students to feel like they were alone in this, and that they were the ones carrying the weight of whether being yelled at here at school by a peer on the playground or whether it was happening at home, for them to realize that all their peers understood and had a connection with feelings and how they show up in our bodies. And without without having the class of you hosting talking circles and having that beautiful opportunity as adults for me to see it in adult action, it made it more real for me to be able to continue to host the talking circles in this setting. And this might be my last year in teaching elementary school, and I'm just so grateful that to have that reassurance as the team behind me still thinks I should be teaching curriculum, teaching canned curriculum out of a book, and facing that direction. So I hope that it continues with the next counselor that they bring in, or the next social worker.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Tina. You gave me the chills talking about it, and it just kind of shows like the idea of a ripple in the pond and how things can, continue to manifest themselves. And I think restorative, even connecting that to restorative justice is essentially what you're doing in the classroom, right? And oftentimes when we punish somebody, it's really not connected to what happened, and it doesn't restore anything or doesn't make anything better. It's just a punishment that they're supposed to learn from. But by you giving those students the opportunity to connect in such a way, I mean, how meaningful is that? That it, it literally restores, the harm that that was caused in whatever the situation. And what ages are you working with, Tina?
Kindergarten through 6th grade.
Yeah, see how beautiful is that? Kindergarten through 6th grade. So just kids, young kids, and having the opportunity to participate in that. And think about the the ripple in the pond there, and the seeds that are planted, and having the opportunity to participate in something like that, and learning how things might be resolved in such a way, or how you might grow or restore things in such a way, and how they might be able to use that later, or even be more open-minded about it if they encounter something like that
Mhm.
later on. I just think it's just so beautiful, Tina. And I just want to say thanks so much for the work that you do. I've loved having you as a student for all these years, and hearing about the work that you do through your practicum last year and through these conversations. And you're just such a beautiful soul, and the work that you do with the kids. I just know how much you care about them, and I think that's something that I value so much. Oftentimes in social work or education, we are kind of told we're not supposed to care in such a way. Um, but I know that you do, and it just adds. I just have so much respect for you and love for you in that regard. And so I think you said it's your last year, and I know whatever it is that you do, they'll be extremely lucky to have you wherever you move towards.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. I appreciate just you and the example that you've been able to offer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right. I think we had a couple more comments here. We had Monica said, "I'm incredibly grateful to have met and learned from yourself and Alicia. I think about social work education and the professional space, and understand now that I don't have to fit perfectly within it. Social work is much more than degrees, licensure, etc." And yeah, I think I really appreciate the comments, Monica. And there, well, I'm going to talk a little bit more about just what you just said in a minute. So I appreciate you sharing that, and I'll get to it in just a minute. And Alice said, "I think that teaching outside of the box is where we need to be. As the mother of young adult boys, I can look back now and really recognize the deficits that our education system has. Yeah, I agree. Just a second here. Let me get myself back on the screen. Okay. Sorry, Tina, I bumped you out. Hopefully you can reconnect. Um, yeah, I appreciate the comments. Let me get back here to my little talking points that I wanted to talk about because it connects with everything that you're saying that you all are saying. So I want to talk about revolutionary social work values. There's 10 of them. There, I think that they need to be revisited and maybe changed a little bit. I think some of them are interconnected and a little bit redundant and things like that. But I wanted to talk about some of the values, and maybe I can get some feedback on if you think anything's missing or just any feedback that you have whatsoever. But I'm not going to go through them in order or anything like that. But there's some that I think are connected and that we can talk about together. And a lot of social work or a lot of revolutionary social work is simply about relationships. And several of the values reflect that. There's kinning or kinship, there's relational grounding, there's reconnection or connection, and there's unity. And kinning would mean that our circle of who counts as kin, it goes beyond. We often think of kin as our family or our kids, but I think it goes beyond that. And I think one of the things that even say talking circles does is it builds kinship. We become kin over time. We get to know each other. We build deeper relationships. I think it can include the land that you live on. I've tried. I've lived in and only lived in this house and on this land for I don't know, 4 or 5 months. But I've tried very hard to connect with the land and become kin with the land that lives here. There's a big tree out there. There's a lot of trees, but there's one big one, and I try as much as I can to acknowledge it somehow and to think about the history of the land. Who planted that tree, or how did that tree come to be there? What other families and people did that tree help and interact with? And just thinking about those things. I try to create kinship here in the community. Every morning, I walk my kids to school, my oldest kids, and then me and my daughter take a circle around town and we walk through the park and we walk through. There's a little main street, and I try to connect with the people in the community. There's an elder that I talk to every day. I'd walk by him at first, and he'd kind of nod his head, and I'm not so good at introducing myself in such a way, but I made a point to him. His name's Uncle Roy, and every day now we stop and we talk story with him for a few minutes. And what a beautiful thing that is to have an elder here in the community that we talk to every day. And I try to sit down and although I'm trying to cut down on coffee, I try to sit down and order a cup of coffee at the coffee shop and talk to people that come around, things like that. Ancestors. Some of us don't know who our ancestors are or were, but I try really hard at this point to. I have a blessing of being able to go on genealogical records, and there's memoirs and journals and letters and stories that I can read. But I think also just kind of meditating on it and trying to connect and knowing that I am who I am and I couldn't be here without those ancestors, and knowing that they weren't perfect and that they're flawed just like all of us, but trying to connect and be kin with them. We've talked a lot about this in my human behavior in the social environment class about the responsibility that we have just beyond our life right now in the moment. But how are we shaped by the past, by our ancestors, by the people that came before us, but also what responsibility do we have to shape for the future, for our children, our grandchildren, and beyond, if that makes sense. And how can we be kin? Can we be kin with generations that aren't even born yet? Some, like Lakota, Native American Indian culture, would say that talk about the 7 generations, and that we're a part of that and we're responsible for that. And so I think thinking about that, relational grounding would be about responsibility and reciprocity within those relationships. Reconnection would be reconnection's huge for me in my own story and my work with addiction. I think for those of us from that summer class that have been working on reconnection and disconnection, substance abuse through a lens of reconnection and disconnection. Um, I think we've learned that disconnection is the main wound, and it's not substance abuse. It's not using the drugs. It's not the crimes that we commit. It's not all of those other things. It's being disconnected, and it's not an individual failure. And that in order to heal, the number one thing we can do is reconnect. And then thinking about unity. is I think it's something that is challenging in today's world. There's so many things that separate us, and there's so many arguments and ways and things that divide us. But I think that what unity and at least in revolutionary social work says that we can be connected and we can have wholeness without being the same. It goes back to what Jade was saying about the truth on the other side of the room. We don't need to erase our differences in order to stand together. And matter of fact, some of the people that I love the most, that I'm most connected to, have much different life experiences, different perceived racial backgrounds, different cultures than I do, and I feel more connected to them than many people that you might say were shared the same perceived culture or perceived racial background as I do. And so I think that when we hear revolutionary social work, we shouldn't picture like a lone social worker fighting systems, like maybe in radical social work or in critical social work, but maybe like we would want to picture a web of relationships that we're constantly tending to and repairing. And if you've never thought about this or seen an image of it, you might want to look up mycelium from mushrooms. So mushrooms obviously spring out from the ground or from wherever, and they have a mycelial network before, and it communicates. It communicates with the trees, it communicates with other mushrooms and things like that. So I like to look at revolutionary social work like that, as like an internet, almost a web that we can connect, and through changing ourselves and reconnecting and uniting and whatnot, that it can blossom and grow, even if we can't always see it right in front of us. Um, and so, a question that I have for you all is, if you look at your own life right now, think about where you feel the most connected and where do you feel the most disconnected, and what can you do about that? We've been talking about this quite a bit, uh, you know, as I said in the substance abuse class and whatnot. And then there's other values that focus more on like inner work and love in action and things like that. They would be transformative reflection, love as practice, and a big piece of revolutionary social work, as I said earlier, is inner work. Transformative reflection is more than just taking care of yourself or self care, which obviously we should emphasize it in social work, but sometimes we overemphasize it without really giving the room for transformative growth or transformative reflection. So, like I said, it's more than self care. It's more than writing a journal entry. I think it's being willing to see the ways that we've internalized things, the ways we've internalized pain, suffering, oppression, dominance, fear, things like that, and then actually doing the work to unlearn it. I think that's a key part of it, is unlearning. Another one of the values, like I said, is love as praxis. And praxis, some of you might not be familiar with that word, but praxis is essentially the intersection of theory and practice. So you might learn a lot about theory uh, in classes and whatnot, but what does theory mean if we don't have any practice along with it, if we don't have any reflection along with it? And so love is practice isn't just like a feeling. It comes about like in how we show up, how we listen to other people, how we listen to ourselves, the inner wisdom that we have. How do we set boundaries? How do we struggle with each other instead of throwing each other away, or struggle with each other, I should say, instead of throwing each other away or putting each other down. And when I think about how I connect this to my teaching, I think that's exactly how I design my classes. In practice, it's how we sit down with the other people's pain, not just our own, but sit down with someone else's pain without turning them into cases, if that makes sense, like a case study. We're real living human beings, and how can we share those things together? Um, some other things that come up in the revolutionary social work values would be centered around power, politics, and knowledge, things like that. Challenging the status quo, nonpartisan commitment, recentering indigenous and African-centered wisdom, social work beyond the profession, things like that. So I think when we think about revolutionary social work, we have to be honest about power. One of the places I have power is in a classroom, and so I try to do my very best to co-create with students and share that power. Challenging the status quo means that we don't accept that this is just how it is. We don't When we say that's just the way it is, it's not a neutral statement. Like when people say there's no work in social money, there's no money in social work, um, things like that. That's not a neutral statement. That's like reinforcing it, and that's accepting the status quo. I think the question to ask there would be like, who benefits from things staying that way? Why do social workers not make any money? Why is that? Does anybody benefit from that? Does anybody stand to keep the power or to consolidate power because of that? Um, I mentioned earlier, but nonpartisan commitment, meaning that we don't let a political party or party labels do our ethical or our reflection work. Uh, you might go and vote, which can make a difference. In some cases, it might not, but it can make a difference to vote. Or you might not vote, depending on how you feel and the difference you think it makes. But I think that the key there is that our accountability isn't to Democrats or Republicans; it's to each other. It's to ourselves, to each other, and to find some kind of liberation. By liberation, you can mean a lot of things. You might think like liberation from slavery, but what about slavery, like as in uh, our captivated minds, things like that. Um, and then when I think about recentering indigenous and African centered wisdoms, and I think this needs to be broadened um, to to make it more inclusive here. But I'll talk about this in a minute. But when we talk about decolonizing Thanksgiving and things like that, but I think one of the mistakes or the ways that it's misperceived is we only look at the oppressive side of it. Not saying that's not important, but what about like the erasure of it completely? Do when you read a social work textbook, does it really is it really inclusive? Does it center indigenous or African centered wisdoms in any way? From my experience, it doesn't. If it includes it, even if they talk about how those populations are marginalized, they still marginalize the wisdom from it. And there's so much that we can learn and so much that we can get from it. I went to the NASW National Conference in Chicago a while ago in June or whatever, and it was really cool. But one of the things that I didn't like about it was or that I felt that it was flawed is that there were no African elders, no indigenous elders. There were a lot of black people. I think that's one of the things that the NASW does very well is uplift and give space to Black Americans and whatnot. But where are the elders at, and where's the more traditional wisdom that comes with it? Where's the indigenous wisdom? And I think the more that we name that, it can help us survive. It you know there's ways of healing and ways of looking at the world that have been preserved even with all the erasure and all that. And I think that revolutionary social work would say that we need to learn from those traditions instead of pretending that our profession invented everything to do with social work, if that makes sense. And I think this will tie into a big talking point that I want to have here in just a minute about the whole Trump administration and the deprofessionalization of social work and some of the implications there. But social work beyond the profession, I think that social work is over professionalized. Not saying that the profession is not important, but it's over professionalized, meaning that it's oftentimes it's only about the degrees and the licenses. And I think that that just omits all the people in the world that are doing social work, outside of that, outside of in their profession, even professional social workers doing social work outside of the profession. And if I'm honest about it, I've said this before, but right now, I'm not a traditional social worker. You know what I'm saying? I don't work for a social work agency. I'm an educator. I educate social workers. And the very best social work that I ever did was before I even knew what social work was, working in a treatment center with kids, with troubled kids, supervising the treatment facility. That was the very best that I've ever done, the most difference that I've ever made in a social work sphere. And at that point, I didn't even know what it was and had no education in that regard. So it just means that it goes beyond degrees and licenses. Some of the most revolutionary social work is done by people who will never be called social workers, at least on paper. Let me check the chat and see. Jade asked if I'm going to teach um, the addictions class again this upcoming summer. I do not think so because I guess there's a chance that I might be asked to do it, but I doubt it. I think that my term at the university will be ending this May. So while I really enjoyed teaching that class and it was very meaningful, um, I won't be. I don't think I will be, but maybe somewhere else. And also, we're getting a paper published, and we did a presentation at the NASW Alaska conference. And so, if anybody's interested, I'll pass on that information, the paper when it gets published, hopefully in the spring. Um, I just wanted to talk briefly, and I talked about this in the jam session, so it may be a little bit redundant for some of us. But this idea of decolonizing Thanksgiving, uh, I think most of us, maybe not everybody knows, but a lot of the narrative, at least the former narrative. I don't hear so many people talk about it in this way anymore. But when I was a kid in school, we definitely were taught, at least to some degree, that Thanksgiving was a celebration of the American Indians coming together with the Pilgrims and them sharing dinner together and giving thanks together for each other. The Wampanoag people, if I'm saying that right, I think. And obviously, there's a lot of pushback on that today, and a lot of American Indian culture and tradition and people were just completely, you know, categorically wiped out, systemically wiped out in certain ways. Not saying it's not here at all anymore, um, but to a large degree, it's not there anymore. And so I've seen a lot of videos and things on social media that talk about decolonizing Thanksgiving and saying that we tell the wrong story. But from my perspective, and people can correct me, but I haven't actually heard that story in a long time. I don't know, my kids haven't mentioned it at school. I know that they're here in an indigenous community in Hawaii, so it might be a little bit different than, like, say, Utah, where I grew up. They might still be talking about it. I don't know. Um, but to me, the bigger issue to me is that it's the complete erasure, is that we don't talk about it at all. I think very few of us, including myself, up until recent years and a lot of work on my own part, didn't have really any idea what happened to the indigenous people of the continental United States, of Alaska Native people, Native Hawaiians. You might have some idea, but, like, for example, in the continental United States, or in Alaska for that matter, but in the continental United States, there's tons and tons of different cultures and tribes and different ways of looking at things, different languages and things like that. And so it's very hard to learn all of it and know all about all of it. And I guess it might be said that it's almost impossible to know all of it. Um, but for example, I grew up in Utah, named after the Utes, and I don't remember ever talking about Utes. We might have talked about Native Americans a little bit, but I don't remember ever really discussing, like, what happened to them or where they were at. Where was their reservation at this point? Why were they on a reservation? All of those things. And I used to be a fan of the University of Utah football team, and their mascots, the Utes. And just for that reason, I don't follow them anymore. But I think that if you went to a and they have the whole tribal thing on feathers and everything on the helmet, on the logo. I think that if you went to a Utah Ute game and you surveyed the fans, I think that, like, upwards of, like, 99% or somewhere around there would have no idea either. And what does that say? I think that that the real error there is just the almost a complete erasure from public discourse and from the way that we think about it. Um, so and I think another thing that comes up is land acknowledgments. And the first time I heard a land acknowledgement was actually at the University of Hawaii from my professor, Angela Davis was a guest professor for my class, and she gave a keynote presentation one night, not in our class, but for the wider community. And she did a land acknowledgement and acknowledged that she was on Native Hawaiian lands and things like that. And I thought it was really cool, and I really respected her for that. And I thought it was meaningful. I thought it was thoughtful, and now you'll see land acknowledgments everywhere. Like, pretty much any organization you go to, any especially a university is going to have a land acknowledgement. You might see them in syllabi, things like that. And I'm not saying that's bad. Obviously, like, talking about it in some way is good, but to me, it's the exact opposite of what Angela Davis did, where she prepared it herself. She did it of her own accord. It was thoughtful. It was meaningful. She was reflecting. Whereas it just becomes part of, like, I don't know, like, procedurally almost. And so I think that in order for a land acknowledgement to be really meaningful, it takes work. It doesn't require just putting it in a syllabi or just talking about it or reciting something that was written already for you. It requires really looking deeper into it. And that's one way, we can decolonize ourselves. And so, going back to decolonizing Thanksgiving, I think to me, it's not just about canceling a holiday. I think many people celebrate Thanksgiving and might have a turkey and a Thanksgiving, or turkey and pumpkin pie and all that, and are really grateful and want to show gratitude. And the real thing is they don't even think about Native Americans at all when it comes to it. And so I think, it's kind of refusing to accept that narrative and to spend some time learning ourselves and looking a little bit deeper, and not accepting, a story that erases, the genocide of American Indians and Native Americans. And, I don't know, people might look at it differently. Some people might think about it as an ongoing occupation on stolen land. Other people might look at it differently. But at least engaging with it and exploring that tension, if that makes sense. Um, and so, revolutionary social work perspective, you might ask yourself, how do we tell the truth in ways that move us toward more relationship and repair and less of, like feel good performative actions, if that makes sense. Um, just checking the chats here just a second. Don't see anything. All right. Um, I was going to talk a little bit about my resignation. That may be news to some of the people in here in the chat. Some of you already know, but I did resign from the university, not effective immediately, but at the end of the spring semester. And, I don't want to go into details, or I don't want to diss the university or anything like that. I think that everybody's doing the best that they can under the circumstances that they know and what they think and what they believe. But I just want to say this is that I think being a revolutionary social worker or somebody that thinks that way, I think that I have to constantly consider my values and, the structure and the institutions that I'm in. And if they don't line up, then I have to make a choice at some point. And I have to ask myself, does it work for me? Does it fit for me? And at some point I had to say that it's not working for me. Not saying that nothing works or that it's all bad. And I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that I don't align. And that may be with all universities. I don't know. I'm still working through all of it. And I don't know exactly what the future holds. I do know that leaving is hard. It's very scary. It brought me back to when I worked at Cottonwood Treatment Center and supervised the facility for a long time. I'd always say that I was gonna quit and move on to something or go back and get my education after the next set of kids left. But there would always be a new set of kids, and it was very, very hard. And at one point, I had to do it, and the place ended up shutting down anyways. It was very hard, and it reminds me of that now because I know that again, going back to social work and all that, and education is that you're not supposed to say that you love your students or things like that, but I really do. Like my relationships with the students that I've worked with over the years that I work with now are very, very meaningful, and it was very, very challenging to leave um, for that reason specifically. But it's also scary. Um, it's scary to leave and start something new. I just gotten to the point where I was really kind of perfecting or honing in my craft of how I do things. And I felt very good about it and confident. And I think it's also a sort of manifestation. I truly believe that we can manifest any kind of reality, and sometimes it doesn't come about exactly how we think it will, or how we thought it might, or how we tried to predict it would. And I think I've been trying to manifest something different for a while, and in a sense, that manifestation is pushing me to do something different. And I can't have a change if I just remain doing the same thing forever and don't have any time to do anything else, if that makes sense. So it's scary, it's hard, um, and it just leaves me having to trust the universe, trust the world, that it will work out for me, trust in a higher power. And if I stay rooted in my values, then my work will find some kind of new form. And I don't know what I'll be doing later. I have several months to figure it out. And I hopefully I have a PhD when it ends, and then there's some more opportunities that open up. But like I said, it's scary, but it reminds me of Bob Marley has a quote in one of his songs that he says, "Child, why do you look so sad and forsaken? Don't you know that when one door closes, many more will open?" And I really believe that's true. And some of the best things that have ever happened to me or taken place were from another door closing, like that one at Cottonwood Treatment Center. I would have never went to Alaska. I would have never went to Hawaii and met my wife and had my beautiful family if that weren't the case. Um, I think there's a song. I think it's by Garth Brooks, an old country song about unanswered prayers, where he's going around and he really wants to marry this woman and stay with her forever, or something along those lines. And then later on, he's with his wife and his children, and he runs into her at a fair or something, and he reflects, "Wow, I got to thank God for not answering those prayers." Um, and so that's all I could say about it is that I just don't align 100%, and it's time for me to move on and do something different. And I got to trust in like what Bob said, and trust that although this door is closing for me, it's sad and it's hard. Um, that another door will open for me. Um, and that's all I got there. Tina says, I appreciated your journey of decision, I too realize the school system is not aligning with how I want to engage with families and students that are in transition or in state systems. They need deep connections, and that is not offered in this type of system. I love teaching and love the social work aspect of the job. And yeah, Tina, obviously, I can completely empathize with you. And it goes back to that. I was saying that book by Paulo Freire and Miles Horton called We Make the Road by Walking It. Sometimes there's not a path for us and we have to make one. And I think that's what I've done with revolutionary social work. I felt that a path for me wasn't there in social work. And so I made a different one, if that makes sense. Um, and got some more stuff I'm going to get into in just a second regarding um, the whole Trump administration, the deprofessionalization of social work and other professions. But Monica asked, are you able to share about next semester's podcast guests? Actually, I don't have anybody officially scheduled right now. I have several people that have reached out to me, and I told them I'd get back to them. I have some other people in mind. I have some agents, or I don't know what they are, yeah, agents that have reached out to me about some folks in Australia and elsewhere that want to be on the podcast. And so I got to get back to them and figure it all out. And if anybody has any suggestions or recommendations on what kind of people you would like to see on the podcast, then I'm happy to listen and happy to do whatever I can to get them on. I think one thing I'll try to emphasize is having more Indigenous elders. I've had some mixed experiences with how that's went down in the past, but I'm a true believer in that they would greatly contribute to our class and all of that, our classes and our learning. So there's that. Like I said, if anybody has any recommendations, let me know. Um, all right, so let's talk about over the idea of over professionalization in social work, which I've been a big critic of, and then acknowledge the tension there with the Trump era and the deprofessionalization of social work. And so I'm no expert on this. I talked to a lobbyist, a social work lobbyist with NASW, Kyle Hillman. I'll try to share that with everyone later on. I talked to him last week and we talked a little bit about it, but I'm still learning about it as well. So let's see if we can work through it and understand it a little bit better. And like I said, I've been thinking about this tension in social work for quite some time, even though I may not understand all of the implications, but we'll try to get down to the nitty gritty. And if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them as best I can. So like I said, on the one hand, we're very over professionalized in social work. Um, you basically can't practice as a quote unquote real social worker without a BSW or an MSW plus licensure plus continuing education units, CEUs, plus living within the Council for Social Work Education, the CSWE's competency frameworks. And we're often told that this is about protecting the public and raising standards. But I think oftentimes what it does is it actually reduces social work and it reduces it to just a profession under those contexts. But then I think on the other hand, we look at what's happening at the federal level and under Donald Trump, or his administration anyway, under their new loan rules, meaning student loans, graduate degrees get split into professional and non-professional categories. Things like medicine, law, pharmacy, those get the higher borrowing caps, meaning you can borrow more money via loans. And social work is explicitly pointed out to be in the non-professional bracket. And I don't think this is set in stone yet. I think there's a lot of pushback on it. So we'll see what happens with it. But yeah, social work is identified explicitly as a non-professional uh, degree. And so that means, for example, MSW students can only borrow up to a limited amount in federal loans total. And I think it's like 100 grand. So it's still a lot. And they can't take out the grad plus loans. So after you exhaust all of your student loans, then you can get graduate plus loans, or you used to be able to grad plus loans where you have to use your credit and you can take out even more money. And if their programs cost more than that, which many of them do, some of you have been looking at MSW programs and you've seen how expensive they are. They exceed the amount of loan limits. They might be pushed into into private loans, with higher interest and less protection and things like that. Um, but I think there's things to think about there. You got to think about the message there. You must have this degree to call yourself a social worker, right? You have to have it. But the federal government is telling you that your degree is not professional enough to justify the same level of support as, let's say, doctors or lawyers. You're required to enter into a highly controlled educational pipeline, um, but you're not recognized as a full profession when it comes to access to debt, to maybe stability, you might look at it as. And then you might want to think also about on the term in the terms of public service loan forgiveness on top of all of that. The new rule lets the Department of Education kick certain employers out of that. I think they call it the PSLF, the Public Service Loan Forgiveness, if they decide that those organizations have substantial illegal purpose, is what they call it, um, which they are defining in ways that clearly target groups working with immigrants and trans youth. So I think the Trump administration has pushed back hard on those kind of things, and I don't want to get into any kind of debate or talk about immigration or trans youth in here. But I think that that's where some of the pushback is coming, and why the Trump administration is against immigration, against trans people, trans youth, and so they're pushing back in ways like this. And so I think if you're a social worker that works with immigrants, uh, in a nonprofit setting, or maybe a clinic that might serve trans kids, or even like there's in Fairbanks and beyond, there's a lot of organizations, or at least some organizations, that work with homeless trans kids, things like that. Then your work might suddenly not suddenly count anymore as public service, and you won't be eligible for loan forgiveness. And so one way to look at it might be like with that being about budgets, but another thing to look about is, who decides what kind of care is legitimate. And obviously the Trump administration differs with other people, specifically in social work, in that regard. And so I think there's kind of a double bind here, though. So social work is hyper credentialed, over credentialed in a way, and it's super regulated when it comes to what we have to do. But the deprofessionalized and it's deprofessionalized and devalued when it comes to how the state treats our education, our debt, and the communities that we serve. And I think, if we look at it maybe from a revolutionary social work perspective, and we try to sit with that tension, um, on one side, we can't pretend any longer that the credentialing sources are neutral. Obviously, there's a lot of power and tension in there. It absolutely pushes poor and working class students, and you might say a lot of Black, Indigenous, and other marginalized students out of the pipeline or into lifelong debt. But on the other side, I think that we shouldn't ignore the way that this administration is actively trying to weaken public service and punish certain forms of care. Um, so I don't know. Maybe the question isn't just how do we save social work as a profession? It's deeper than that. It's what kind of formation do we actually need to do the work of liberation, if that makes sense. Do we really want a model where the only way to practice is to buy an expensive degree, and then the very government that loans us the money or refuses to loan us the money can declassify you as not professional any longer? I mean, or do we want to build something different? And I think the other side to this tension is that I think is under talked about is isn't it kind of nefarious that that social work students have to take out $100,000 plus in debt to get a social work degree? Is there really no other way? It seems really nefarious to me, and seems like the gatekeepers of social work and social work education, like, it's just messed up, in my opinion. We wouldn't be having this discussion if it didn't cost $100,000 plus to get a social work degree. And I know many of us, I know I have some student loan debt. I know some of us other, some of you have student loan debt, period, or have student loan debt. And I think it's messed up. Social work is notorious for, being one of the professions that there's no money in it. Well, if there's no money in social work, which there can be, so I push back on that. But if there is no money in social work, or very little money to be made in social work, then how can we justify making people take out so many loans, um, paying so much money for an education? Is there really no other way to learn about social work? I would push back on that heavily. And it's just food for thought for you. Charlie says many of the professions removed from the federally supported professions have one thing in common: mandated reporting. I haven't heard that aspect discussed much, but I think it's worth recognizing not only as a red flag, but also the impact that it will have on serving vulnerable populations. Sorry, you just moved. On serving vulnerable populations and the possible limits on publicly funded resource access in cases involving an actual need for law enforcement intervention. Yeah, that's a good point. For sure, Charlie. Um, Sorry, I had a message coming through. I was just looking at it. And I hadn't thought about that before, the whole mandatory reporting thing. And there's I think there's tension around that. I think some people think that social workers shouldn't be mandatory reporters in some way, and some do. But you're right. When you look at those list of professions, a lot of those are mandatory reporters, if not all of them. So that's very, very interesting. And yeah, Christy says $100,000 is crazy. Yeah, so you think about it, you might go in to get a social work degree, an MSW, and in my opinion, be hoodwinked into taking that money, thinking about not thinking about how you're going to pay it back today, but putting it off until tomorrow and get done with the degree and have $150,000 in debt, gaining interest all the time. I hear stories all the time about people that are paying the minimums on their loan and they pay it for 20 years and they owe more than they did before they started paying on it. And so you think about those things, and I hear a lot of the rhetoric about um, people that are against the forgiveness of student loans and saying, "No, I did mine, I paid mine off," or "I didn't take out a loan and I've been working here, working my ass off and pulling up my bootstraps for all these years. And why should you get forgiven and I didn't take out the loans? Why should I do it?" And I understand the perspective. I get the perspective. I'm not saying that's not a valid perspective, but I think that you know that just because we did something different and we might have worked harder, I think that especially in some profession like social work where people are trying to help other people, that we might want to have more empathy for why they might have taken out those loans and the burden that it causes, and how much better of a world we would be in if social workers weren't indebted for a lifetime and were able to actually prosper and thrive so that they could help other people prosper and thrive themselves, if that makes sense. And that's just my perspective. And I think there's a lot of people that would disagree with me in that regard. But those are my thoughts on that. And like going back to revolutionary social work values, for me, this is where the challenge the status quo, social work beyond the profession, things like reconnection, these are where they become really concrete. We had to be brave enough to imagine other ways of preparing people for this kind of work that doesn't demand lifelong debt and political obedience, if that makes sense. And it makes me think of, I mentioned that I had an opportunity to spend a semester with Miss Angela Davis, and she would say, people talk about like prison abolition, meaning getting rid of the prison system as we know it. And a lot of folks can't imagine it any other way because we think that that's just the way that it's been. But actually, mass incarceration is really, really new. And America is one of the only places that do it. We think about like places like Mexico as having these brutal police and brutal prison systems and things like that. And I'm not saying that they don't, but it's America that leads the way when it comes to mass incarceration. And mass incarceration has only existed from like the 70s on. Not saying there were no problems with incarceration before that, but it's really, really new. And so Angela Davis would say, well, we're definitely not ever going to be able to do it if we can't even imagine something different. And so that's what I would encourage anybody that's listening to this. When you think about how expensive social work education is, unpaid practicums it would be another element in there. You might have to take out a loan to pay for your degree to go and work for free at an agency. And I know some of you in here are actually doing that, or at least some part of that right now. So if we can't even imagine a different way, then we damn sure, for sure, will never change it. And so that's what I would encourage you to constantly be imagining something different and make a different road by walking it. It may not benefit you today. You may still have to take out your loans and still have to go through it. But by you reimagining it and not accepting it as just the status quo in the way that it is the first step in actually making a change in that sense. Um, I hope all that made sense. Let's see, let me check the chat here. Um, Charlie or Jesse says the economy is entirely different now too. Things cost more. It's true. Even education didn't cost anywhere near what it costs now. It's kind of how might you say, and it's oversaturated with administration, if that makes sense. You know, in thinking about a new job for next year, I walk my kids up to the school and I talk to the principal up there often. And she was talking to me about becoming a teacher at the school next year. And I was looking at what that entails. And me, if even if I graduate with a PhD, it takes some time to get a teaching license. So I could apply for an emergency teaching license. And they told me that until I got fully licensed as a teacher, which would cost like another $5,000, um, that they would pay me $36,000 a year. And I did the math and like looked at how much that would make a year. And that's like less than what I was making at Cottonwood Treatment Center, where I left 20 years ago, or not quite 20 years ago, but almost 20 years ago to get an education and all of that. And that's just bananas in my opinion. $36,000. That's crazy. And they wonder why they got a teacher shortage in the state of Hawaii and beyond. Like, what a sense of disrespect that you're going to pay somebody, PhD or not even with a PhD, somebody who's thoughtful and coming there to help students and all that, and doing some hard work. I know Tina can empathize with how hard the work of being a teacher is. And $36,000, how are you supposed to survive on $36,000 in 2025? I mean, especially here in Hawaii. Come on, man, that's like it's like not even table scraps, if that makes sense. Um, so just food for thought and interesting in my perspective. Charlie says that the monetary value of asynchronous courses taught. I'm not sure what that's supposed to say. Monetary value of async courses taught you to be disinterested and disengaged instructors is also much lower than their pricing. The math don't math. That's true. And even talking about the math don't math and um, talking about MSWs, a master's in social work, for example. I want to just put it in perspective. We don't even have to do the math. You can just use your imagination to do the math. Well, and this isn't on the money side is messed up too, but so advanced standing MSW, it's 1 year program typically. You got to take 10 classes total, 10 graduate classes, so which are more intensive and a lot more work than a BSW level. So you got to take 5 classes per semester. So let's just do a little bit of the math, and you can do the addition or use your imagination to do it on your own. So um, typically that would include 3 hours in class per week, just in class. They say for every hour you spend in class for a graduate class, you should spend 3 hours outside of class. So that's another 9 hours. That's 12 hours per class. 12 times 5 is what, 60, if I'm not incorrect. Um, so that's 60 hours right there. You think about, then you're supposed to do a practicum, which off the top of my head, I don't even know how many hours, 25 hours a week, probably in practicum hours. Not to mention transportation, not to mention your job, not to mention if you have a family or something like that. Like, just to use Charlie's language, the math don't math. It don't work out. And you either sacrificing every other part of yourself. That doesn't even factor in self-care, taking care of yourself, self-reflection, things like that, recreation, enjoying yourself, having a good life. Um, so if you do all that math, something is being compromised, either yourself, your family, you're cutting corners with the education that you get, one of those things. And so it just doesn't work out. And it's one of those things that I feel like we always talk about evidence-based practice and things like that in social work, but how come the math just don't math? And it's pretty basic math, just some simple addition to show that it really doesn't work out. Um, and yeah, that's all I want to say about that. Um, and yeah, I think I'm running to the end of what I had to talk about. Um, Jesse says, I feel like I do this now in the bachelor's program and I'm not full time. It's hard to balance everything, and some instructors do not care. Yeah, well, I think that social education in period, but social work education could be very rigid. I know I'm different. I don't have strict deadlines in that sense. And I do my best to, be flexible, because I know just from my own life as a PhD student right now and me going through education in the past, I've got a family, I've got a job. Like sometimes I just run out of time. And more than that, I run out of energy. Like there's only so much stuff that you can take in your mind and your consciousness before you go nuts and you don't have it. And some of us have different ways of learning and thinking about things. I have a very cluttered attention deficit disorder type of mind. I've gotten a lot better over the years, but it's really hard for me to juggle like hundreds of emails and assignments that I've got to review all the time and giving feedback and doing my PhD stuff and paying attention to my kids. It can be overwhelming for me. And sometimes I'm like, I just get to a point where like I'm sitting in front of the computer and I'm like just literally falling asleep, and or I'm reading a book at night and I can't even pay attention to it, or I can't listen to my children, or I can't listen to my students. And like I said, I've improved a lot through practice on that. But like with deadlines and stuff, I'm very much more open minded. And I think some professors, some teachers would say it along the lines of they're teaching you for responsibility for the real world so you can meet deadlines when you're a professional and things like that. But I think what it also teaches us is that we're not important and that our lives are not important. And if we run into an issue or something like that, then that's not important. What's important is that we meet an arbitrary deadline. And I can also empathize with professors too, because if everybody turns in their work super late, then that professor is who's also overwhelmed um, has to grade that work late and has to do it last minute and things like that. So I also empathize with it, and I deal with that to some extent myself. Um, and I think it all begs the question: is like, why are we all so overwhelmed, and why do we all have so much to do? Isn't there another way where we could be less burdened and less filled up with the things that don't matter and more filled up with the things that do matter, like connection, um, reflection, taking care of ourselves, our family, relationships? I think there is. I think that we just get stuck in, again, the status quo and the way that things have been done for so long is that we have trouble seeing another way, and we've got to make another road and imagine it to be a different way. So I'm hopeful that social work might, you know, dissent and go a different route at some point. Um, but it ain't going to happen today, and it ain't going to happen tomorrow, at least like literally tomorrow. It might happen tomorrow, as in sometime in the future. Um, but that the way that things are right now is that a whole new path would have to be created, and that's hard because organizations like the NASW, the National Association for Social Workers, the Council for Social Work Education, CSWE, they've got a firm grip on that power. Not to mention the exams and things like that, where there's so much money involved in it. Even you think about how much money is involved in education and social work. Think about like textbook companies. How hard do you think that textbook companies like Pearson and Routledge and other ones like that, how hard do you think they probably lobby against open educational source materials? Like probably super, super hard. And I've been pushed back myself on it. Many of you are aware of the way that the university is affiliated with the Barnes and Noble, with the textbook bundle thing where you have to opt out. If not, they just order the textbooks or whatever for you, and you have to pay for it. Think about that. Like that, if that ain't a scam, I don't know what is. If you know what I'm saying, and it's like everybody knows it, but like we still have to go along with it. We still have to do it. Um, so that's what revolutionary social work is about, is reflecting on those things, reflecting on the power behind all of those things, the money. Why are things the way that they are? Oftentimes because um, there's so much money in there, and someone or some organization has so much to lose. Uh, so yeah, that's what I got. And thinking about textbooks as well, thinking about why do they do a new version every year or a new edition every year? Of course, there might be new information, but oftentimes they're very minimally changed. But if there's all these used version or say third edition textbooks out there, if they don't make a fourth edition, then everybody's just going to buy the used edition, and they don't make any money off that. And so, that's what it's about. Where's the money at? Where's the power at? If we got rid of licensing exams, who would stand to lose out on that? If there was another pathway to social work education and licensure, how might the Council for Social Work Education, who accredits universities, how might they lose out on that? If there were another organization of social workers, how might the NASW lose their power? Things like that. Um, if we gave students more power and we shared the space and let them co-create, how much power would the professors lose? What about a department? Things like that. Those are the questions that I think we ought to be asking and that we need to be asking. Well, that's all I got. I went a lot longer. I only intended to go for an hour uh, here today. Um, but I just want to say that I appreciate everybody that tuned in um, and asked questions, contributed to the dialogue. I really, really appreciate you. Many thanks to you. Thanks to everybody that listens after. I probably try to get this one because it's kind of timely. I'll try to get it up and published here soon. And like I said, if anybody has any recommendations for guests, then I'm happy to hear them. I'm going to try to get to episode 100. I think I'm on eight by the all these ones that I haven't produced yet. If I get them up, I think I'm on 80 something. So it'll still be a challenge with only so many weeks in the spring semester. But I really like to end on 100. That would be super cool to graduate with my PhD and end on episode 100. Um, so I'll try to get that done. So send me some recommendations. Um, some of you might even want to be guests yourselves, like Charlie, former student, has been a guest on the Revolutionary Social Work podcast. But Charlie, you might want to come on the Critical Social Worker, a little different style. Um, but yeah, um, that's all I got. So I'm going to close it there. And yeah, Charlie, connect with me. Jade, make sure you stay in touch. Send me an email and I'll add you to the jam sessions if you still want to come ever. I'd love to see you and I'd love to connect with you anyways. Make sure you have my phone number and our numbers. We can exchange numbers so we can stay connected. Much love to you all. Have a great rest of your day. Take care. Peace and aloha. We'll see you next time.